Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Man of Honor, the Autobiography of Joseph Bonanno, by Joseph Bonanno, narrated by Tom Perkins. That which we are, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Ulysses, Alfred, Lord Tennyson. Introduction. I wish to provide an honest portrait of myself and of my times, so that you may judge for yourself what kind of man I am. My name is Joe Bonanno. I am 78 years old and a grandfather. I've often been described as a gangster, a racketeer, a mobster. I'm supposed to be, or to have been, or to have wanted to be, the boss of all bosses, whatever that means. At one time or another, I've been accused of trying to take over New York, California, Arizona, Wisconsin, Colorado, Alaska, and choice provinces of Mexico and Canada, too. I am not unmindful of my past. Who knows better than I my mistakes and my accomplishments? This book does not attempt to foist apologies or to deny facts. To arrive at a balanced picture of a man, one must make a thorough examination. Most of my reputation has been a product of exaggeration and ignorance. A great deal of it is complete balderdash. Life is richer, deeper, and infinitely more complex than its representation in the mass media. Therefore, if you have picked this up expecting to hear the confessions of a no-good, no-account Sicilian, or if you expect a chronicle of blood and mayhem, pass this book on to someone else. I have put too much time and care into these memoirs to have them consigned to the category of cheap thrills. I want to be understood for a change. I have had many problems with that, being understood. The biggest regret of my life is that I have never totally mastered English. I can manage all right for everyday use, but I cannot speak with wit or elegance. It is a failing I share with many an immigrant. I claim no distinction in my adopted language. The words come to me sometimes in English, sometimes in standard Italian, and sometimes in the Sicilian dialect of my hometown. Occasionally I throw in a word or two of French. I speak a hybrid language. To make myself understood, I have enlisted the help of a scribe to write this book. Through him I can express myself in proper English. Since I am an educated man, it should not altogether amaze you that I can think long thoughts and that I can quote from famous books. All too often, Sicilians are made to sound doltish, simply because they have faulty diction. In their native tongue, those same Sicilians can be eloquent. Even so, there was a difference between most of my fellow Sicilians and me. I was luckier than most in that I had a formal education, which included college. Among my Sicilian friends in America, I was always singled out as a man of learning, if for no other reason than my ability to recite from the Divine Comedy or to expound on a few passages from The Prince. Most of the men I knew in the New World were not what you would call bookish. Men such as Charlie Luciano, Albert Anastasia, and my cousin, Stefano Magaddino, were baffled whenever I would slip a literary allusion into our conversations. When I spoke Italian, they often complained that I used words they did not understand. They had grown up in the impoverished fields of Sicily or in the tenement streets of America. Their language was coarse and expedient. My friend, Vincent Mangano, when exasperated over one of my intellectual flourishes, would say, "Peppino, but with you we have to look things up in the books. How do you expect us ever to finish our meal?" Whatever your opinion of me, the truth is that I am the last survivor of an extinct species and of a bygone way of life. I have known people from both extremes of life. I have seen virtue and I have seen depravity. My life is full of ironies. Very often when I review my life and juxtapose all its diverse elements, all I can do is laugh, the sardonic laughter of one who has seen much and has lived to tell the story. It was a triumph in itself to have survived the volcano, my figurative name for New York City. Most of the old boys died in the turmoil. I'm still here. Thank God I can still laugh. I'm also thankful that I still have a good memory. The past is more vivid to me now than ever before, and the patterns of my life seem clearer because I can see them from a greater distance. And perhaps, if I tell my story faithfully, you will learn not only about me, but also about yourselves and the society in which we live. Book 1. The Odyssey. 1. My earliest childhood memories are not of my native Sicily, but of America. When I was 3 years old, my father, my mother, and I, their only child, moved from our hometown of Castellammare del Golfo to the United States. We settled, among other Sicilian immigrants, in the Williamsburg section of Brooklyn, where we lived on North 5th Street in Roebling, not far from the East River. Across the river was a place called New York City. Down the block was the elementary school where I would begin my education. We spoke English there. At home we spoke Sicilian. Other ethnic groups lived around our neighborhood: Jews, Poles, Armenians. The cops were Irish. The beer vendors were German. The Sicilians all complained about the cold weather. Back home it was almost always warm. In America we saw snow and slush for the first time. You had to burn wood to keep warm in the winter. If a horse-drawn fire engine trundled down the street, I would follow it to the fire and collect scraps of wood to bring home. The reason for my father's departure from Sicily in 1908 has always been something of a mystery to me. A story I later heard from relatives was that my father left to avoid prosecution. The case against him was eventually dismissed, but by that time we had already moved to the New World. In Sicily, a place that had not yet entered my young consciousness, my father was known as a man of honor, words that meant nothing to me then but were to become the touchstone of my life. He was the head of the Bonanno clan, the leading family of Castellammare. That responsibility, which he could not escape, placed strict limits on his life in Castellammare, so I imagine that as proud as he was of his tradition, he at least partly welcomed the move to America. The Castellammarese immigrants remained a tight-knit community in the New World. They had come with energy and high hopes, but everything they owned was in a suitcase. They had to look out for one another and cooperate. For example, if an immigrant needed money, he could not expect much help from a conventional bank. Most Sicilian immigrants could not show any credit or collateral for a loan. However, they had what they called the Italian bank. Some of their own countrymen had money to lend them, if no one else would, and these men acted as neighborhood bankers. Their interest rates might be higher than the establishment bankers charged, but at least you could do business with your own people. They did not give you the cold shoulder. You had to pay up on time, but that's true of everything. Even so, with the neighborhood banker, you could get an extension on your loan, perhaps by doing him a favor. Everyone has his talents. The Williamsburg neighborhood also had something called the Italian lottery. It was a cheap game that offered a big jackpot. For a very small bet, you stood to gain 1,000-fold if you were lucky. It was incomprehensible to most immigrants and other poor folk that such a lottery was illegal. If you were rich and could afford to bet money in a gambling casino, or if you played the stock market, you were safe from the law. If you were poor and bet a penny, it was illegal. It was a strange country. Americans were difficult to fathom. Drinking beer and whiskey was okay, but drinking wine, which Sicilians made in their basement stills, was considered the exotic habit of foreigners. We couldn't imagine that someday they would be so foolish as to prohibit the drinking of alcoholic beverages altogether. Since he was a Bonanno, my father's reputation preceded him to America. The Castellammarese immigrants in Brooklyn looked up to him, as their relatives had in Sicily. Downstairs from our apartment, my father opened a pasta factory to satisfy the neighborhood demand for fresh macaroni and spaghetti. Across the street from the pasta shop, he opened a tavern. In the rear of the tavern was a small kitchen. Customers could always count on a big pot of stew bubbling with potatoes, green vegetables, pig's knuckles, tripe, and maybe even some lean meat. They referred to my father as Don Turidru. In my language, Turiddu is an affectionate nickname for Salvatore, just as Peppino is a nickname for Giuseppe. Don is equivalent to the English sir. I remember being told a story of the relationship between my father and his friends at the tavern. One evening, a Castellammarese brought a friend, who was Italian but not Sicilian, to Don Turiddu's tavern. The customers already in the tavern guessed the man was not Sicilian because, upon entering, he did not pay his respects to Don Turiddu. The Castellammarese, however, immediately made his way to Don Turiddu and asked for his blessing. The Castellammarese and his friend sat at the bar. They drank all they wanted. The Castellammarese put a check on the counter. Don Turiddu picked up the check and deposited it in the big old cash register behind the counter. The puzzled stranger asked his friend, "Aren't you going to ask for the change from your check?" "Don Turiddu knows best," the Castellammarese said stoically. "But you have change coming to you." "And what do you expect me to do? That's the way it is around here." The seemingly high-handed conduct of the tavern owner rankled the stranger. "What if you had come into the tavern with just a few coins instead of a big check?" the non-Sicilian asked. "Then we still could have drunk here all night." "And what if you came in here with no money at all?" "Ah," said the Castellammarese, "it wouldn't have made any difference. We could have still drunk here all night. You see, Don Turiddu is my friend. In the winter, when I often don't have any checks because there is no work, I can come here to drink and to eat all I want from the big pot. Don Turiddu pays for it then. That's the Sicilian way." When I was 7 years old and in the 2nd grade, my father would take me to the Nickelodeon to watch Neapolitan moving pictures. He would tell me stories. He told me the inventor of the telephone was not Alexander Graham Bell, but an Italian named Antonio Mucci, who used to live in Brooklyn as we did, and was an owner of a candle factory across the bay in Staten Island. In that same candle factory worked Giuseppe Garibaldi, the Italian liberator, who was in political exile at the time. "Garibaldi came to the New World just like us," my father would say. My father said that while in the New World, Garibaldi also went to Uruguay and helped liberate it from Brazil. When he was in the United States and the Civil War broke out, Garibaldi sent a letter to Abraham Lincoln offering his services to the president. My father would talk about America, of how rich it was, and of how much more time it would need to mature and to be truly great. "Perhaps in another 100 years this country will be civilized," he would say. Like everything else he said to me at that age, I would only partly understand. The full significance of his words became clear to me later in life. One evening my father had a long talk with me. He said we were going back to Sicily. He looked serious, and it was because of his grave face, rather than the announcement itself, that I cried. He held me sympathetically, but was in firm control of his emotions. Even when I was a 7-year-old, my father addressed me in a dignified manner. He said, "You are a Bonanno. Be proud." His voice soothed me, and I stopped crying. Castellammare del Golfo is situated deep inside an emerald gulf at the western tip of Sicily. The name means castle by the sea, and there is an ancient castle in the center of the town's waterfront. I was home again, in the land of Mezzogiorno, the land of midday, where people sang in their misery and their joy, where the sun was your constant companion, and the hot and dusty sciroccoes blew across the sea from the Libyan desert. In the wind you could smell grapefruits and lemons. I had lots of exploring to do. I would walk up to the top of the ancient castle and look out at the open sea, green toward the shore and blue in the distance. Playing hooky from school to go swimming was a constant temptation. One day after missing school, I came home looking rather disheveled. My mother told me to take off my shirt. After I stripped to the waist, she licked me on the shoulder. "I taste salt," she said. "You went swimming, didn't you?" Then she spanked me. Naturally, I did not like being slapped, but I never resented the spankings from my mother. The more she spanked me, the more I loved her. On the way home from La Playa, the town's main beach, I would linger to hear the fishermen singing while mending their nets. If a fisherman on the beach needed a bucket and ladle to empty the bilge water from his boat, he would make a lilting aria out of it. "Somebody bring me the bucket and ladle, please." The peasants who worked the hills behind Castellammare spoke a totally different dialect. They sounded lyrical even when talking to their donkeys and sheep. The fishermen and the farm peasants could barely understand each other, and if you went to a neighboring town, yet another dialect would tickle your ear. I had some difficulty at first speaking solely in Italian. I must have impressed my new schoolmates with my English, and I must have taught them slang words such as swell and okay. But after a while, English words slipped out of my vocabulary altogether. My new friends called me Peppino instead of Joe or Joey. I told them all about my trip across the ocean, and we played many games. The top of the castle was the deck of our ship, and it seemed natural for me to take command. I knew about ships. I ran a tight ship, too. Strict discipline aboard. I swore to go down with the ship if it sank, all the way down to the bottom of the sea, where the fishes could enjoy me. The reason for my father's return to Sicily was vague, but I later learned that he was needed home because the old rivalry between the Bonannos and the Buccellatos, the two major factions in town, was festering once again. This ancient family feud had molded my father's character and had framed his life. At the end of the 1800s, the Bonanno house was preeminent in the Castellammare region. The family owned land, cattle, and horses. In comparison with other families, the Bonannos were well off. They wielded vast influence. The family leader was my grandfather, Giuseppe Bonanno. My grandfather had 4 sons. All of them would inherit part of his wealth, but only one of them, the one with the necessary qualities, would assume his power and position. He would lead the family. Giovanni, the oldest son, showed little inclination for this role. He moved to Tunis, where he became a very successful farmer and rancher. Among his vineyards and Arabian horses, Uncle Giovanni probably led the most peaceful life of all the Bonanno brothers. The second son, Stefano, was a quiet and devoted family man. Upon his father's death, he promised his mother that in order to take care of her, he would never marry. Uncle Stefano had a calm and modest disposition, and he acted as adviser to his younger brother, Giuseppe. Giuseppe, the third son, had the necessary inward resources, coupled with a natural extroverted charm that made him popular. Uncle Pepe was a leader of men, and the family's mantle of power fell on him. One of the stories I remember about Uncle Pepe involved his indoctrination of a young disciple. One day he abruptly and without any explanation ordered the young man to take off his jacket and shirt, for he was going to get a beating. The order stupefied the young man because he had done nothing to provoke my uncle. What could it be? What had he done to deserve a punishment? Confused though he was, the young man dared not disobey my uncle. He dutifully stripped off his clothes and kneeled. My uncle then repeatedly thrashed him over the back with a plated bullwhack. Not a sound, not even a peep, my uncle admonished while administering the beating. When it was over, my uncle told the young man to wash. He helped to gently towel dry the young man, and then smeared lemon juice on the welts raised by the whiplashes. This stung sharply, but it prevented infection. My uncle didn't appear to be at all cross with the young man. Before the young man had a chance to ask about the nature of his wrongdoing, he beheld my uncle blithely taking off his own jacket and shirt. "Take the whip and give me twice as many lashes as I gave you," my uncle instructed. "Mind you," my uncle added when the young man hesitated, "if you don't whip me as hard as I whipped you, I'll give you a second beating." The young man whipped his master, and afterward helped to dress his wounds. "You understand how it is?" the older man asked the younger. "It's one thing to say you're never going to talk against your friends, but it's quite another not to talk when someone is beating you. I wanted to see how well you took a beating." As for the youngest son, my father, Salvatore, his future was mapped out largely by his mother. He was sensitive and intelligent, and his mother wanted to spare him intrigues, vendettas, and feuds. It so happened that one of my grandmother's first cousins was a Monsignor. The church was an accepted and certainly the safest form of social advancement. Clergymen held power in their own right. My grandmother, therefore, sent her youngest son to study at a seminary so he could become a priest. If the Bonanno family was the dominant power in the Castellammare region, the Buccellato family was the rival power. The Buccellatos were trying to expand their sphere of influence, and this inevitably set them at loggerheads with the Bonannos. Feuding played a large part in Sicilian culture, not because people relished it, but because they were fighting for their very survival. Centuries of overcultivation have depleted Sicily's soil of its richness. Most of the island has been deforested. There is not enough rain. It is hot and dry most of the year, and arable land is at a premium. Sicily was stripped of its natural resources by conquerors, who also took the choicest land, leaving the scraps to the natives. Since there were more mouths to feed than there were scraps, the natives often fought among themselves to get their share. Sicilians have come to look upon poverty, scarcity, and death as constants in their lives. The have-nots will do almost anything to escape this misery, and the well-to-do will fight in order not to sink back into it. In some respects, the feuding resembled the range wars among the cattle barons in the American West. In western Sicily, as in the American cowboy frontier, men fought over cattle because cattle made a man rich. The sons of a long-time ranching family were easy to distinguish in Sicily. They ate more meat than the general population and consequently grew to be taller than the rest. For instance, the Bonanno brothers were all 6 feet tall or better. In the countryside behind Castellammare, there was not enough good grazing land. Ranchers could not afford to fence in their property, so they had to let their cattle feed on common pasture used by other ranchers. These conditions almost invited rustling, and thefts of cattle resulted in retaliations. One skirmish brought on another, foray followed foray, confusion abounded. If the Bonannos did not find a natural explanation for an event, they blamed the Buccellatos, and vice versa. For example, the Bonannos and their supporters were never willing to believe that the death of Stefano Bonanno was purely accidental. One day, as he was winding his way up a narrow mountain trail on his mule, Stefano came upon a bend where a rock slide had made passage impossible. The startled mule must have skittered and reared up. My uncle's body was found on the side of the mountain. Who was to say that the Buccellatos or one of their cohorts had not intentionally arranged the rock slide beforehand, knowing that Stefano Bonanno was going to ride up the mountain that day? No one could prove it, but suspicions persisted. The chief ally of the Bonanno family was the Magadino family, headed by Stefano Magadino. At one point in this struggle, Felice Buccellato, the patriarch of the Buccellato clan, orchestrated a scheme which resulted in Pepe Bonanno and his right-hand man, Stefano Magadino, being sent to jail. The case against them succeeded because of the collusion of a bribed law officer. For a time, Pepe and Stefano were sentenced to house confinement on a prison island off the coast of Sicily. After their release, Stefano Magadino did not put anything beyond the guile of Felice Buccellato. The Bonanno ally said that Felice was not even beyond hiring criminals and bandits to fight his battles. His name should be Ruination, Stefano Magadino would say of Felice, whose name in Italian means felicity. One night, Pepe Bonanno was awakened by one of the caretakers of his house. My uncle was in the second-story bedroom, and the man was calling him from the ground floor, part of which was used as a stable. The caretaker shouted for help in disengaging 2 fighting horses. When Pepe went downstairs, a rifle boomed. When the rest of the household hurried down to investigate, they found Pepe Bonanno dead. Uncle Pepe's murder caused my father, who had grown restive with seminary life, to re-examine his plans. His Latin and Greek studies, his musings over the city of God, suddenly seemed frivolous exercises. He heard the call, the ancient call, both dreadful and enchanting. The call to action, the siren call of the old tradition beckoned him. Salvatore had the choice of thinking only of himself or of taking care of others. Since he was studying for the priesthood, he had a perfect excuse for shunning the grimmer duties that awaited him. He could have remained in cloistered selfhood and gone on to become a rosy-cheeked pastor. He could have been more self-centered, placing personal tranquility over sacrifice. Instead, he chose to help his family. If we were to ask a man such as my father who he was responsible for, he might answer, as I would answer, "For as many people as need me." My father, then only 21 years old, devised a brazen plan that would dissolve his obligations to the church and bring him home, regardless of his mother's objections. He showed up in Castellammare in possession of a gold candelabrum which belonged to the Monsignor. The Monsignor wasted no time in expelling him from the seminary. Salvatore had come home, but he was inexperienced in the affairs of men. His father and older brothers were not at his side, so the role of guide and counselor to the fledgling fell to Stefano Magaddino, the most stalwart and most feared of the Bonanno followers in Castellammare. A gruff, burly, and uncomplicated man, Stefano Magaddino had been one of Pepe Bonanno's closest friends and was known to friends and foes alike for his toughness and bluntness. Not long after Salvatore Bonanno returned home, 2 members of the Buccellato clan met their death. The people of Castellammare had their own idea as to who was responsible, but they kept it to themselves. Salvatore was seen more and more in the town square, in the social clubs, in the fields. He had grown into a fine-looking man with deep-set eyes and a rakish handlebar mustache. In 1903, he married Catherine Bonventre, a girl educated by nuns in a convent. Catherine's mother was Stefano Magaddino's sister. Thus the marriage solidified the bonds between the Bonannos and the Magaddinos. After I was born, on January 18, 1905, my father, in a bid for lasting peace, asked his archenemy Felice Buccellato to be my godfather at my baptism. Buccellato agreed, and the villagers called me the Dove of Peace. 3 years later my father left for America. While my father was away, Stefano Magaddino became the leader of the Bonanno faction. Felice Buccellato resented the Magaddinos' rise to power, which he felt had come at the expense of his own family. Tension rose. Relatives and friends implored my father to return to Sicily to accept his ancient responsibility. The social order was disintegrating. 2. I used to love to ride my pony to the Greek temple at Segesta. This magnificent Doric temple, about 10 miles out of town, overlooked my family's farm in the hill country behind Castellammare. The temple roof is missing, but all its 36 columns are standing. The side lintels in the front and rear pediments are also intact. The color of the temple would change with the progress of the sun, from a soft gold at noon to a bronze at sunset. Swallows nested inside the temple, and green lizards darted in and out of the masonry cracks. Orange poppies grew on the hillside. You could hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cows. On rainy days I would roam through the temple grounds foraging for snails, which my grandmother fried in garlic. The temple was built on a lofty spot in the countryside in honor of Demeter, the Greek goddess of agriculture. The goddess's altar is missing from the temple, as throughout the entire island of Sicily, conquerors and invaders have come and gone through Segesta with devastating regularity. All that remains of the Greek town itself is scattered stone blocks. Grass and shrubs cover the dead city. Although it is easy for outsiders to list Sicily's foreign invaders, it is difficult for them fully to appreciate what this perpetual turmoil did to the Sicilian character. It is one thing to understand, and yet another to feel. But let us just run through the list of invaders. Greeks, Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Romans, Vandals, Byzantines, Saracens, Normans, Angevins, Aragonese, Bourbons, fellow Italians, and the Allied army during World War II. No wonder that Giuseppe Tomasi of Lampedusa, the Sicilian author of The Leopard, called Sicily that America of antiquity. The island has a stew of races.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?